What comes to your mind when hearing VA panel? Well, I immediately think of dark level smearing, which is looking something like this. It's caused by slow response times, particularly in those darker tones, and this is super typical for VA panels. Or should I say it was super typical for VA panels, because this is what the Innocn 27G1S looks like, and the difference is pretty insane. Like sure, the Samsung G3 that I selected for this little comparison is one of the slowest monitors on the market and also just a 144Hz monitor. But I wanted to show these side by side because it's just mind-boggling to me that these monitors are actually using the same panel technology. But don't worry, we're going to be looking at more relevant comparisons in a bit. You're probably going to be surprised by how this VA panel stacks up against fast IPS or even TN and OLED panels. So, what even is this monitor? Well, it's made by Innocn, who is a Chinese OEM and ODM that, according to their website, have been making monitors for brands like Acer, Gigabyte and HP. So yeah, even if this is your first time seeing an Innocn monitor, chances are you've already seen one of their products with another brand's logo on it. The 27G1S, however, has their own logo on it, and this is a flat VA panel monitor with a refresh rate of 240Hz and a 1440p resolution. That's certainly not a combination you see every day. Now, having a VA panel comes with some pros and cons. One of the big advantages of VA monitors certainly is that these typically are more affordable than their IPS counterparts. The 27G1S usually is about $100 to $200 cheaper than a comparable IPS monitor. Of course, I have this monitor as well as some alternatives linked down below. Now, VA also has another advantage, a high contrast ratio. And the 27G1S is no exception. With a contrast ratio of roughly 3500 to 1, it has a noticeably higher contrast than a typical IPS panel. And that's great for watching videos or movies. Darker content or black bars look much better than on a lower contrast panel, and that's especially true when using this monitor in a dimmed room or at night. Now for nighttime usage, the minimum brightness is low enough at 65 nits, and the maximum brightness is also pretty respectable, though I wouldn't mind having an even bigger brightness range in both directions. Now the 27G1S also supports HDR. But as you would expect, sub 400 nits peak brightness doesn't make an amazing HDR experience. And unfortunately, the HDR accuracy is all over the place, so watching HDR content on this monitor isn't exactly enjoyable. Kinda unfortunate, as the high native contrast ratio would allow for a better HDR experience. Now the SDR accuracy is decent out of the box. Sure, the white point is off, which really is an issue most monitors have, but this can be corrected pretty easily. More importantly, the gamma is rather accurate, just as the color hues. And the high average delta E can mostly be explained by oversaturation, because this is a wider gamut monitor with a color gamut volume of roughly 1.3 times sRGB. In case the oversaturation bothers you, the 27G1S also offers an sRGB mode. And it actually does what it's supposed to do and clamps the color gamut to sRGB. These numbers look pretty good, despite of the white point, which is not crazy far off, but unfortunately Innocn blocked the RGB controls in this mode, so we can't easily correct it. That's super unfortunate, as this otherwise would be a great sRGB mode. Now after playing around with the settings, this is where I settled. Unfortunately, the RGB adjustment isn't as fine-grained as I would like it to be, so the white point doesn't quite hit the target without sacrificing too much contrast. But yeah, realistically, this is good enough. A full calibration and profiling will fix the white point anyway, and as we'd expect, the color accuracy is excellent after applying the ICC profile. In case you don't have access to a colorimeter, you can download my ICC profile from the video description. It's meant to be used with these settings, which I found to be the most optimal for color accuracy. Now let's shift gears a little and talk about gaming. The first thing I'd like to mention is that the design of the stand base doesn't go well with larger mousepads. Just like most monitors these days, the 27G1S comes with a V-shaped stand base that takes up a lot of space on the desk. I'd love to get the monitor even closer for competitive FPS, but then I'd have to put it on the mousepad and would probably smash my mouse right against the stand. Other than that, the ergonomics really leave nothing to be desired. The height adjustment range is large, and tilt and swivel are adjustable as well. Portrait mode is also possible, and the display can even be rotated in both directions, so you can decide where the big bottom bezel goes, which is kinda neat. And the stand even has an integrated cable tunnel, which is something you typically only find on more expensive monitors, like on the Alienware AW2723DF for instance. The positioning of the power input though really isn't optimal for cable management, so it doesn't look quite as clean as Alienware's solution. Anyway, let's take a look at the response times and ghosting performance. We get 4 different overdrive modes, and yeah, as you can see, there's not a huge difference between them. But what's immediately clear is that the overdrive off setting was already using a considerable amount of overdrive. This surely is not a true off setting. It's a pretty well-tuned mode, so that's not really an issue, but having a mode with slightly less overdrive would also have been a neat addition. Normal and fast even add slightly more overdrive and are really on the edge of too much overshoot, so I'd recommend sticking to off. The response time measurements show that there's really not much to gain when switching from off to normal. 0.5 milliseconds faster response times on average really aren't a worthy trade-off for the increased overshoot. The off mode also works great across the refresh rate range. I wouldn't be surprised if Innocn are actually using variable overdrive here, as the inverse ghosting is pretty well controlled even at low refresh rates. But let's circle back to the response time charts for a minute. I kinda glossed over them, but the response times performance of the 27G1S is actually super impressive. For comparison, the Alienware AW2723DF is one of the fastest IPS monitors I've tested. And yeah, the 27G1S actually is even slightly faster. Pretty insane, but it's somehow able to match the average response time of the Zowie XL2566K, which is using a very fast TN panel. So what does this actually look like to the eye? Compared to fast IPS monitors like the aforementioned Alienware or the LG 27GR83Q, there really isn't much of a difference. Like if you look super closely, you can spot slight differences in how these monitors handle the dark track, which kinda gives away that the 27G1S is using a VA panel. But this is not to say that the 27G1S is performing any worse than these IPS monitors. It's basically on par with the fastest IPS monitors of the 240Hz class, which is extremely impressive. Now, even though the XL2566K has the same average response time, the UFOs look a bit better in comparison. Partially, that's thanks to the higher refresh rate, which reduces motion blur. At 240Hz, it's looking more similar to the 27G1S. And the LG OLED monitor, well, it's the clearest image out of all of these monitors, but yeah, it's also much more expensive. Now, Innocn also implemented backlight strobing, and yeah, it's usable, I guess. It does have more crosstalk in the middle of the screen that I would like to see, but overall it's not a terrible implementation. Compared to the best backlight strobing modes, it's obviously lacking sharpness and also brightness. So the 27G1S is definitely not a monitor for backlight strobing enthusiasts. Now, if you're a big fan of adaptive sync, you should 100% avoid this monitor. With adaptive sync turned on, there's a ton of flickering in synthetic tests as well as in actual games. The only scenario in which it kinda works is if you can ensure very stable FPS. So honestly, I'd recommend just leaving adaptive sync turned off, which isn't a huge deal for high frame rate games like Valorant and Overwatch, but low frame rate single player games benefit a lot from adaptive sync, so if that's what you play, I'd suggest looking for a different monitor. Unfortunately, adaptive sync flickering is pretty common for VA panel monitors, so an IPS monitor is your best bet. Now, on a more positive note, the display lag is basically as low as it gets on a 240Hz monitor. 0.1 milliseconds of processing lag is among the lowest I've measured, which is great to see. So as the display lag is very low and the response times are exceptionally fast, this seems like one of the very few VA-based monitors that's actually a good pick for competitive FPS. And yeah, after quite a few hours of Valorant and Overwatch 2 on this monitor, I can safely say that this easily is as good for competitive gaming as a comparable monitor with a fast IPS panel. Like at times I totally forgot that I was using a monitor with a VA panel, and I never had this with any other VA monitor. I mean, I've used other very fast VA monitors before, like the AOC PD27, which basically performs like the Samsung G7, or the Philips Evnia, which also has a pretty fast VA panel. And yeah, they come close to fast IPS monitors, no question, but this is the very first VA monitor I've tried that fully matches the best IPS panels when it comes to FPS gaming. I honestly didn't think that we'd ever get a VA monitor that can actually match the speed of IPS, and I surely didn't think that it would be from a brand most people in the West haven't even heard of. But yeah, here we are. So this is serious competition for the LG 27G-R83Q. Since its launch, the 27G-R83Q has come down in price pretty significantly and usually can be had for $350 to $400 US, which brings it a lot closer to the price of the Innocn 27G1S. I've got them both linked down below, so please compare prices before making a decision. If your main focus is competitive gaming, the higher price of the 27G-R83Q is really hard to justify. Unless you're using adaptive sync, the 27G1S is the better choice. However, if you're playing a lot of games that don't exceed 240 FPS, the 27G-R83Q with its flawless adaptive sync performance is starting to make a lot more sense. The same is true if you care about photo or video editing or other stuff that requires accurate colors. The 27G-R83Q has a very good sRGB mode and even supports hardware calibration. Generally, its IPS panel is the better choice for anything color critical, as the better viewing angles offer a more consistent image. Watching movies is way more fun on the VA panel of the 27G1S though. Personally, I'm just super excited that we now got a monitor with a VA panel that's actually great for competitive gaming. But if you're on the market for a 240Hz monitor, I'd suggest also taking a look at the IPS alternatives and checking out my review of the LG 27G-R83Q. I have that review linked on screen right now. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.